Imagine, if you will, trying to build a massive, globally dominant organization. I mean, we are talking about an entity that spans continents, right? It influences the laws of nations, and it shapes the daily decisions, the finances, and the moral compasses of millions upon millions of people.
Right, a total global powerhouse.
Exactly. But here's the catch. You are not allowed to have a CEO. You cannot build a global headquarters anywhere. You cannot write like a standardized employee handbook that everyone is forced to sign. And you absolutely cannot fire a local branch manager if they just decide to take things in a completely different direction.
I mean, honestly, it sounds like a recipe for immediate, spectacular collapse. You're describing an organizational structure that, by all conventional logic of human group dynamics, should just shatter into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces within a week.
Right?
Yeah, because without a center of gravity, human institutions almost always succumb to entropy. They just fall apart.
Exactly. It sounds like absolute chaos. But what if I told you that not only did this exact structure survive, but it also became one of the most culturally dominant, resilient, and, well, adaptable movements in modern history?
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are so thrilled to have you with us, the listener, because today we are embarking on a custom-tailored exploration of a truly fascinating worldview, which is Baptist Christianity.
And we are looking at this specifically through the lens of a psychological profile you shared with us, your internal Kenny sub-personality.
Yeah, famous Kenny.
Which is a brilliant and honestly vital lens for this specific topic. Because the Kenny persona, as you described it, is the architect of integrity.
Right, he's the builder.
Exactly. This is the part of you that values practical habits, moral clarity, and rigorous systems of personal responsibility. It is the part of you that believes life is essentially maintenance.
Yes.
And that abstract, high-minded ideas are completely useless unless they are built into a daily, functional, accountable system.
Right. Kenny does not want to just sit around a campfire hearing a nice, vague philosophy about being a good person. He doesn't have time for that.
No, not at all.
Kenny wants to know how the gears actually turn. Like, how does the system hold itself accountable when nobody is watching? How do you maintain quality control?
And that brings us to the core paradox of the material we are diving into today.
Right. How did a highly persecuted 17th century religious minority, a group of people who completely and utterly rejected top-down centralized authority, grow into a global Protestant powerhouse?
Well, to even begin to untangle that paradox, you have to completely rewire your brain regarding how religious institutions work.
Okay, let's unpack this. How do we rewire it?
You basically have to throw out the idea of a centralized corporate religious structure. When we think of massive global religions throughout history, we usually think of Rome or Canterbury or ancient patriarchates in Constantinople.
Right, we think of massive buildings and sprawling, rigid hierarchies, popes and bishops.
Exactly. But the Baptist tradition is the ultimate historical example of grassroots Christianity. It is a decentralized, bottom-up movement.
So there's no boss.
No boss. Ultimate authority does not rest in a physical building, and it does not rest in a titled cleric. It rests solely on two foundational pillars.
Which are?
The text of the Bible and the individual human conscience.
Wow. Okay, but to truly grasp the mindset of this worldview, to understand why they are so intensely, almost aggressively allergic to top-down authority, we can't just look at what they believe today, right?
No, you really can't. You have to travel back in time.
Yeah, we need to step into the absolute religious and political powder keg of the early 1600s in England.
Yes, the early 17th century. So this is the period following the massive seismic shock of the Protestant Reformation.
Right? Things were messy.
Very messy. And the atmosphere in Europe at this time is highly volatile. You have to understand that back then, religion and the state were deeply and inextricably fused together.
There was no separation of church and state whatsoever.
None at all. The king or queen was not just the head of the government collecting taxes and raising armies, They were the supreme head of the church.
So the way you worshipped wasn't a matter of personal preference.
Not even a little bit. It was dictated by the strict law of the land.
To be born English was to be born into the Church of England. There was no separation. You didn't get to opt in. When you were born, you were baptized as an infant, right?
Exactly.
And that baptism was essentially your birth certificate and your citizenship rolled into one. It meant you belonged to the church, and therefore you belonged to the crown.
Precisely. And into this highly controlled, state-mandated monopoly steps the founders of the Baptist movement. This really begins with two early historical streams.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, you have the General Baptists, who form around 1609 in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam, so they were already fleeing.
Yes, they were led by figures like John Smith and Thomas Helwys, who had fled England and were heavily influenced by Dutch Mennonites, who were another radical group at the time.
Right.
And then a bit later, in the 1630s, you have the Particular Baptists.
Okay.
They emerged with a theology more heavily influenced by Calvinism. But regardless of their specific theological nuances, both streams were looking at the state-controlled religion of England. They were looking at the bishops and the mandatory tithes and saying, no, absolutely not. This is fundamentally illegitimate.
But I want to pause here because I think it's really easy for us in the modern world to underestimate the sheer danger of that no.
Oh, it was incredibly dangerous.
Right. Rejecting state churches and clerical authority wasn't just a polite philosophical debate over tea in a university parlor. It was viewed as literal political treason.
It was treason. When these early dissenters said, the king does not have the right to tell me how to worship, or I refuse to have my infant baptized into the state church, the crown didn't just hear a theological disagreement.
What did they hear?
The crown heard, I do not recognize the king's ultimate authority over my life. Because by rejecting infant baptism, they were rejecting the foundational mechanism by which the state claimed ownership of its citizens from birth.
Wow. It's like an early high-stakes version of an open-source software rebellion.
I love that analogy, yes.
I mean, imagine taking on a massive monopolistic tech giant that controls all the hardware, all the software, and the entire power grid. These early Baptists weren't just trying to tweak the code, like suggesting a minor change to how a church service was run.
Right. They weren't asking for better music.
Exactly. They were arguing that no one should own the operating system. They were saying the state's monopoly on the human soul is a violation of basic human design.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The core conviction driving people like John Smith, Thomas Helwys, and later Roger Williams was that faith, by its very definition, must be voluntary.
Because if it's forced...
If religion is mandated by the government, if you are forced to attend a specific parish under threat of crushing fines, public whipping, or even imprisonment, then your faith isn't genuine faith at all.
It's just state-enforced compliance.
Exactly. And to a mind that values integrity, like your Kenny persona-forced compliance, is the ultimate moral failure. It's an empty system.
Right. Kenny hates an empty system.
So Thomas Helwys actually took this conviction to its absolute limit. He wrote a daring, unprecedented defense of universal religious liberty. He stated famously that even the king is just a mortal man, and therefore the king should not and cannot control the immortal soul of any person.
And he didn't just write this in a private diary, right?
Oh, no. He had the audacity to send this directly to King James III.
Which is mind-blowing. He sent a letter to a monarch who literally believed in the divine right of kings, basically saying, stay out of my mind and my soul.
Yeah, he really did.
What happened to him?
Well, King James VI had him thrown into Newgate prison. And Newgate was a horrific, disease-ridden place. Helwys died there a few years later. He paid the ultimate price for the idea of the voluntary conscience.
He literally bet his life on it. He was all in.
He was. And then you have figures like Roger Williams, who takes this entire open-source rebellion across the Atlantic to the American colonies.
Right, the new frontier.
In 1639, he founds the first Baptist church in America. But Williams doesn't just start a local church. He is so committed to this idea of voluntary faith that he helps establish the colony of Rhode Island specifically on the principle of absolute religious freedom.
Oh, wow. So Rhode Island was kind of the testing ground for this.
Exactly. It was a safe haven for anyone, and I mean not just his own group, but anyone whose conscience was being oppressed by state religion.
And if we pan out and look at the broader historical trajectory, you can start to see why the American colonies, and later the frontier of the United States, became such incredibly fertile ground for this specific worldview.
Because you have this vast, expanding frontier.
Right. Far away from the heavy, suffocating hand of European monarchs, state-appointed bishops, and entrenched institutional power.
The environment completely matched their theological operating system.
Yeah.
And then, as we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, you have the Great Awakenings.
Which were huge.
Oh, massive. These were highly emotional, sweeping revival movements across North America. Because think about the logic here.
Okay.
If your core premise is that faith must be voluntary, it means you can't just rely on people being born into your ranks. You have to actively present them with a choice.
Because they aren't baptized as babies anymore.
Right, so revivals were the perfect mechanism for this. They weren't about maintaining a quiet, inherited parish life. They were about confronting people with a message and demanding a conscious, deeply personal decision to opt in.
It's the ultimate viral marketing for grassroots theology.
It really is.
I mean, it didn't require a bishop to travel across the ocean to consecrate a multi-million-dollar cathedral. All it required was a Bible, a passionate preacher standing on a stump in a field, and people willing to make a personal commitment.
And that is exactly how it spread like wildfire. But as it spread, it ran headfirst into a massive structural problem.
And this is exactly what Kenny, our systems architect, is screaming at us right now.
I'm sure he is.
Because if you completely reject centralized authority, if you literally strip away the bishops, the synods, the popes, and the kings, what on earth do you replace them with?
That is the million-dollar question.
Like, how does this rapidly growing, wildly decentralized movement not just immediately splinter into a million different, unrecognizable, chaotic factions? You can't just have a million people making up their own rules and still call it a unified tradition, right?
No, you can't. That is the defining existential question of their history. And the answer lies in a very specific, rigid framework of governance and belief. The tradition developed 5 defining ideas that act as the non-negotiable guardrails.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, the ultimate authority of the Bible. Second, believers' baptism. Third, salvation by faith. Fourth, congregational autonomy. And fifth, religious liberty.
Okay, so let's really drill down into that first one because everything else collapses without it. The ultimate authority of the Bible.
Right. The concept of sola scriptura, meaning scripture alone.
Scripture alone. Because if we contrast this with other massive traditions, say the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church authority in those systems is basically a 3-legged stool.
That's a good way to look at it.
It's the Bible, absolutely, but it is equally church tradition and hierarchical leadership like popes, patriarchs, and historic councils. The Baptists look at that stool, kick 2 of the legs away, and say, no, the buck stops entirely with the text.
Which is a terrifying amount of weight to place on a single pillar. And it immediately forces the next logical issue, which brings us to their 4th defining idea, congregational autonomy.
Because someone has to read the text.
Exactly. If the Bible is the only supreme authority, the obvious question is, who gets to interpret it? Who decides what the text actually means when there's a disagreement?
Right. If I read a passage and think it means X, and you read it and think it means Y, who settles the debate?
Well, in the Catholic system, the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, settles it. In the Baptist worldview, it is the local congregation, period.
Wow. Just the people in the room.
Yes. Each individual church governs itself like a small, completely independent democracy. The members vote on everything. They vote on hiring pastors, they vote on the annual budget, they vote on major church policies, and they even vote on theological stances.
So there really is no boss.
None. There is no global Baptist headquarters that can dictate terms to a local church in Dallas or Nairobi or Seoul.
Okay, I have to push back here. I have a major problem with that logic, and I know Kenny does too.
Let's hear it.
If there is no central boss, how does this not just turn theology into a sheer popularity contest? I mean, if the pastor is basically an employee who can be fired by a 51% majority vote, isn't there a massive, undeniable psychological incentive for that pastor to just stand up every Sunday and tell the congregation exactly what they want to hear just to keep his job?
You are hitting on the exact razor-thin vulnerability of the entire system. Yes, that risk is absolutely present, and historically it has happened.
It has to have.
It definitely has. But the system's defense against becoming an echo chamber relies entirely on the rigorous individual moral integrity of the congregants themselves. The franchise analogy works well here.
Right, like every local branch is independently owned and operated, but they all share the same logo and the same basic operating manual, the Bible.
But with one critical, terrifying difference. In a corporate franchise, like a fast food chain, there is still a corporate headquarters that can revoke your franchise license if you stop serving the signature burger and start selling tacos.
Right, corporate will shut you down.
Exactly. But in the Baptist tradition, there is no earthly headquarters to revoke the license. The psychological weight of this is immense. Without a pope, without a patriarch, the responsibility of maintaining the integrity of the faith falls entirely, 100%, on the shoulders of the local community.
So if the local church goes off the rails, there is no bishop coming to save them.
Nobody is coming. They are on their own.
That is incredibly heavy. I mean, that means you cannot just coast on the authority of the ancient institution. You can't just show up, sit in a pew, and assume the people in Rome or Canterbury have the theology handled for you.
Right. You can't outsource your faith.
You, the individual, are responsible for the quality control of your local branch.
Precisely. And this fundamentally redefines the role of the pastor. Pastors in this tradition are not viewed as priests who possess a special mystical power to mediate between the people and God.
They don't have a special hotline.
No hotline. They do not hold structural, unquestionable authority. They are hired as teachers. They are shepherds. They are respected for their intense study of the text, but structurally, they are accountable to the democratic vote of the congregation.
You can really see this stark difference when you look at how they actually gather for worship.
Oh, absolutely. The contrast is huge.
Yeah, like a Catholic service, for example, is highly liturgical. It is deeply rooted in the mystery and the literal transformation of the elements in communion. The architecture, the incense, the vestments, it's all designed to evoke the authority and mystery of the historic church.
Right.
But Baptist worship is entirely stripped down. It is intensely sermon-focused. They view communion or the Lord's Supper purely as a symbolic memorial, not a mystical transformation.
Yeah, there's no transubstantiation.
Exactly. They intentionally avoid elaborate rituals, icons, or strict liturgical calendars because they believe the focus should be purely on intellectual engagement with God and the text, not on a prescribed ceremony.
But the stripped-down approach raises an essential question for any systems engineer.
Okay, what is it?
If there is no central institution holding these independent democratic franchises together, and you've removed all the highly orchestrated ancient rituals that visually and physically bind other traditions, what is the glue? What keeps this hyper-decentralized network culturally unified across centuries and continents?
The answer is their namesake, the defining act. Baptism.
Yes.
So as we established earlier, not just any baptism. We are talking specifically about believers' baptism. And this is where the mechanics of their system get really distinct.
Because in many other major Christian traditions, as we discussed with the state churches, you are baptized as an infant.
Right. Water is sprinkled or poured on you before you can even formulate a thought, let alone articulate a theological stance.
Exactly. But in the Baptist tradition, baptism is exclusively reserved for people who can personally, consciously profess their faith.
And it's not a polite little sprinkle either. It is full physical immersion in water.
It is. And to understand the power of this, we have to look at the psychological engineering behind the practice.
Okay, let's look at the psychology.
It basically revolves around the concept of the testimony. What's fascinating here is, in this culture, before you are baptized, you don't just sign a piece of paper. Sharing your personal conversion story, explaining publicly how you lived before, how you encountered the teachings of the Bible, and exactly how you made the decision to change your life. That is a vital, universally expected practice.
It's the ultimate terms of service agreement, but played out in real life.
That's perfect, yes.
I mean, infant baptism is like inheriting a subscription to a service, right? You might use it, you might ignore it, but the account was created for you by someone else. You didn't do anything.
Right, you're just grandfathered in.
But believers' baptism is like standing up in a crowded room, reading the terms of service out loud, looking everyone in the eye, and clicking "I agree" with your entire physical body by being plunged under the water.
That is exactly it. And that public declaration is incredibly binding, psychologically speaking. By requiring individuals to stand before their entire community, articulate their personal story, make themselves vulnerable, and make a conscious adult choice to be submerged, the tradition culturally engineers a profound sense of personal ownership.
It's brilliant.
It really is. It shifts baptism from a covenant sacrament administered to you by a powerful institution into a personal declaration made by you as an autonomous individual.
And when you frame it like that, it makes total sense why people still convert to this tradition today.
Oh, absolutely.
Often, people who grew up in traditions where faith was just the cultural background noise, like a ritual they inherited but never really thought about, they seek out this environment because they want a faith that feels actively chosen. They want the authenticity and the friction of making a deliberate personal commitment. They want to be the ones steering the ship.
And this intense focus on conscious choice, explicit personal contracts, and structural accountability. This brings us perfectly back to the psychological profile of the listener's internal persona. This is Kenny's absolute dream system.
It really is. It is a one-to-one match. Kenny, the architect of integrity. So what does this all mean for someone like Kenny?
Well, let's look at the underlying psychological worldview here. The Baptist view of human nature is that people are fundamentally created good, but are deeply inherently flawed and affected by sin.
So we need a little help.
More than a little.
Hmm.
The belief is that left to their own devices, human systems degrade. Therefore, they require active spiritual redemption and constant moral maintenance.
And look at the specific virtues they value above almost all others. Faith, of course, but heavily paired with integrity, humility, extreme personal responsibility, and evangelism.
If we speak directly to you, the listener, and specifically to your Kinney persona, the Baptist worldview functions as a massive, distributed ethical system.
Right.
Kinney believes that life is maintenance, and that systems require constant upkeep. Well, because this faith is a conscious personal choice, it is not something that magically sustains itself. It requires daily, rigorous discipline. It requires habits. It requires active, exhausting service to maintain that structural integrity.
So it means this isn't a mystical heads-in-the-clouds spirituality. It's an engineer's approach to morality.
Exactly.
Think about the personality traits that are actively rewarded in that kind of environment. If you are part of a community that is governed by a democratic vote, where your personal public testimony matters, and where complex scripture is the ultimate authority, who rises to the top?
The ones doing the work.
Exactly. The people who thrive are going to be those with unshakable personal conviction, severe moral discipline, and aptitude for logical argument, and a capacity for community leadership. The blueprint is the Bible. The maintenance is personal discipline, and the quality control is the local congregation.
And that system of quality control is brilliantly woven into their weekly ecosystem. It's not just a Sunday morning thing.
Right, it's a whole lifestyle.
The practical experiences that build this worldview are relentless. You have Sunday morning services, Sunday evening gatherings, Wednesday night Bible study groups, highly organized youth programs, potlucks, and church business meetings.
That is a lot of meetings.
It is a highly interactive, tightly knit, constantly churning social ecosystem designed specifically to reinforce moral clarity and prevent individuals from slipping through the cracks.
But all of this intricate internal architecture naturally brings up a crucial question regarding their actual weekly practice.
Right, what does Sunday actually look like?
Exactly. How does a community of Kennys, a room full of highly disciplined, autonomous individuals focused on democratic voting and biblical blueprints, actually gather and express this practically on a Sunday morning? What is the focal point when the music stops?
This brings us to the immense power of the pulpit. As we touched on earlier, worship simplicity is the absolute hallmark here.
Yeah, no smoke and mirrors.
Exactly. You won't find veneration of saints. You won't find intricate liturgical dances. The service is incredibly straightforward. You have singing, which can range widely from historic four-part harmony hymns to modern rock-style contemporary worship. You have communal prayer, you have public Bible reading, you have an invitation to make a decision of faith, and the undisputed heavyweight centerpiece of it all, the sermon.
And we really need to emphasize the scale of the sermon in this tradition. It is not uncommon for a sermon to last 30, 40, or even 45 minutes.
Sometimes even longer.
I mean, in a modern world of 15-second videos and hyper-short attention spans, demanding a congregation sit quietly and listen to one single person speak for 45 minutes is a massive structural choice. It's an eternity.
It is a massive choice.
Yeah.
But if we trace the logic back to their foundational pillars, it is the only choice that makes sense.
How so?
If your entire worldview is built on sola scriptura, the idea that the text of the Bible is the singular ultimate authority for life and eternity, then rigorous intellectual engagement with that text must be the priority.
Okay, that tracks.
The sermon isn't designed to be a light, motivational TED Talk. It is the critical, systematic act of biblical interpretation, theological argument, and persuasive teaching. It is the focal point of the week because it is quite literally the blueprint reading for the congregation's ongoing maintenance.
Okay, but this circles me right back to my earlier pushback about power dynamics.
The CEO question.
Yes. If the sermon is 45 minutes of intense intellectual and moral instruction, and the pastor has the microphone for that long every single week, delivering this to a room full of people taking notes, does that mean the pastor is effectively the CEO? I know you said they vote, but if one guy controls the narrative for nearly an hour a week, doesn't he hold all the actual power in the room?
It's a vital distinction to make, the difference between influence and structural authority. Does the pastor have immense influence? Absolutely. They are the primary teacher, the theological pace setter, and the visible leader. But structurally, technically, they're still an employee of the voting congregation. If a pastor's 45-minute sermons begin to systematically contradict the congregation's historical understanding of the Bible, or, more commonly, if the pastor's personal moral integrity fails in private life, that democratic body will call a business meeting.
And they'll just vote him out.
They will organize a committee, investigate the facts, debate the issue, often with a lot of painful friction and tears, and they will vote to remove him.
And because there's no bishop to step in and reassign him to a different parish to cover it up, the local congregation has to handle the mess themselves.
Exactly. It forces the community to take absolute ownership of their ethical system. The ultimate authority lies in the text and the gathered community's interpretation of it, not in the individual person temporarily holding the microphone.
That is a fascinating, terrifying, and brilliant system of checks and balances. And this sermon structure ties directly into another major, non-negotiable priority of the tradition: evangelism.
Yes, the invitation.
Right. Nearly every single sermon, no matter the topic, ends with an invitation, a direct, regent call for the listener to respond, step forward, and to make a personal decision of faith.
And we need to deeply explore the psychological engine driving this emphasis on evangelism. Because from the outside, particularly to a modern, secular observer, evangelism can often look really aggressive.
Oh, totally. It can look like a corporate recruitment drive or a sales pitch to boost membership numbers, or just plain arrogance, the idea that we are right and you are wrong.
But internally, if you step inside the logic of the system, it's something entirely different.
Entirely different.
Internally, within the strict logic of the Baptist worldview, you have to remember their view of human nature. Human beings are fundamentally separated from their Creator by sin, and salvation, the rescue from that separation, strictly requires a personal, conscious, voluntary decision to trust in Christ.
You cannot be saved by your parents' faith.
No.
You cannot be saved by the state. You have to choose.
Therefore, if you genuinely believe that the people around you are in spiritual peril, and you hold the knowledge of how they can freely choose to be rescued, well, sharing the gospel isn't a sales tactic. It is viewed as an urgent, agonizing act of deep compassion.
It's the classic analogy, right? If you stumble upon the absolute cure to a horrific, deadly disease, keeping it to yourself to be polite wouldn't just be selfish. It would be a profound moral failure.
Exactly. You have a duty to tell people.
You can't force them to drink the cure because faith must be voluntary, but you absolutely have to give them the choice.
That's spot on. Evangelism, in this framework, is considered the ultimate act of love. But here's where the history gets incredibly complex.
Oh, boy.
Because when you combine a massive, rapidly growing group of highly motivated individuals who place a premium on personal conviction and moral discipline, with an urgent, compassionate drive to share and implement their worldview everywhere they go, they inevitably collide with the broader society.
Which brings us to the sheer historical paradox of their social impact. We've traced this worldview from a tiny group of persecuted dissenters hiding in Amsterdam to outcasts dying in 17th century English prison for demanding religious freedom.
Right.
We talked about Thomas Helwys betting his life on the voluntary conscience, but the crazy thing is, they won the argument.
They absolutely did win the argument. That early Baptist advocacy for the complete separation of church and state heavily, directly influenced American constitutional thought.
Like the First Amendment.
Exactly. When the framers of the U.S. Constitution were writing the First Amendment, ensuring that the government could not establish a religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof, they were echoing the exact arguments that Baptists had been bleeding for over a century.
Even the king should not control the soul of any person.
Exactly. They were the ones constantly whispering in the ears of politicians saying, keep the government entirely out of the church and keep the church entirely out of the government, because they had the generational trauma of remembering what it was like to be imprisoned by a state religion.
But this creates a grand paradox. A group that started as the ultimate outsiders, fighting against the levers of state power, eventually grew into a massive, culturally dominant religious force.
A huge force.
I mean, today you have massive Baptist populations in the United States, particularly concentrated in the South, but also sprawling globally across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. They transitioned from being the persecuted minority to holding immense social, political, and cultural power.
And with that acquisition of power came massive, world-altering social movements. But because of their hyper-decentralized nature, that power didn't move in one single direction.
Right, because there's no CEO to steer the ship.
Exactly. It manifested across a vast, sometimes contradictory spectrum. On one hand, you have their incredible legacy of global missionary expansion. Because they believe in active evangelism, they didn't just preach. They built thousands of hospitals, universities, orphanages, and disaster relief charities all over the developing world.
And on the other hand, you have massive movements for domestic justice. Take the civil rights movement in the United States. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just emerge out of nowhere.
No, he didn't.
He arose directly from the rich, historic Black Baptist church tradition, a tradition that took the Baptist emphasis on the dignity of the individual conscience, paired it with the biblical narrative of liberation from slavery, and created a profound engine for justice, community empowerment, and fierce political activism against systemic racism.
And this is exactly where we must look closely at their internal diversity, because this is the biggest mistake outsiders make. Outsiders look at the label Baptist and assume that all of these independent congregations think exactly the same way, vote for the exact same political candidates, or hold identical cultural views.
Which couldn't be further from the truth.
The reality is that the tradition is deeply fractured and incredibly, sometimes paralyzingly diverse.
Because there is no central pope to issue a decree saying this is the official Baptist stance on X.
Exactly. You have the Southern Baptists, who generally hold to strict conservative theology, emphasize traditional family structures, and place a massive organizational emphasis on global evangelism.
Okay.
Then you have groups like the American Baptists, who tend to be much more theologically diverse, often leaning into socially progressive causes. And you have the National Baptists, historically Black churches focusing on social justice, and various independent groups.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because there is no centralized headquarters enforcing uniformity, the Baptist tradition is basically a mirror for whatever local culture it inhabits.
Yes.
It can be fiercely, rigidly politically conservative in a rural farming town in Texas, and it can be radically socially progressive and activist-oriented in a city center in New England. It is the ultimate adaptable organism.
It molds to the shape of its container while keeping the core operating system intact. But that adaptability comes at the cost of intense, ongoing, highly public internal debates.
Because they have to vote on everything.
Because they rely solely on the Bible and congregational votes, they argue constantly about how to interpret the text. Take, for example, the historic debate over Calvinism versus free will.
Oh, this is a perfect example of a system collision. Kenny would love analyzing this.
He really would.
If the entire system requires a voluntary, conscious choice like believers' baptism demands, how do you reconcile that with Calvinism, which basically argues that God is entirely sovereign and has predestined who will be saved?
It's a huge paradox.
Right. If God predetermined it, it's not a free choice. But if it's not a free choice, then believers' baptism is a performance. How do they handle that intellectual friction?
It is a profound systemic tension. The Calvinist-leaning Baptists argue that God is the ultimate architect and that human nature is so broken that no one would freely choose God unless God first fundamentally changes their desires. So the choice feels completely voluntary to the human, but is ultimately orchestrated by God.
And the other side.
The free will-leaning Baptists argue that love and faith are meaningless unless the human has the actual uncoerced power to accept or reject it.
And because there is no pope to settle the debate, local congregations literally split over this.
They do. They split all the time. They also have deep, painful divides over issues like the role of women in leadership. Some Baptist churches proudly ordain women as senior pastors, pointing to biblical examples of female leaders and emphasizing the equality of all believers.
Right.
Other Baptist churches strictly restrict the role of senior pastor to men, pointing to specific letters written by the Apostle Paul to early churches, interpreting those texts as enduring structural blueprints.
And just to be absolutely crystal clear for you listening, as we explore this, we aren't taking a side on who is right or wrong in these deeply held theological and political debates.
Right. Our goal isn't to judge the outcomes.
Exactly. Our goal is to point out that these intense debates exist, and they are a feature, not a bug, of their decentralized system. When you hand the blueprint to millions of independent, democratically run franchises, you are absolutely guaranteed to get radically different interpretations of how the final building should look.
Precisely. But here's the ultimate takeaway. That extreme adaptability, that chaotic ability to splinter, to fiercely debate, to split congregations, and to mold to the local context without needing approval from a distant, sluggish headquarters, is exactly what has allowed the tradition to survive and thrive through centuries of massive cultural upheavals.
It's the secret to their longevity.
Yes. Whether it is a historic Black Baptist church organizing a march for civil rights, or an independent fundamentalist church in the mountains focusing strictly on personal piety and separation from the world, the underlying operating system remains identical.
Local autonomy, biblical authority, and the absolute necessity of personal choice.
Exactly.
It is an incredibly resilient piece of code. It bends, it fractures, but it rarely breaks entirely. Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. Let's synthesize all of this back through the rigorous perspective of Kenny, our architect of integrity.
Let's do it.
What we've uncovered is that Baptist Christianity is the ultimate grassroots faith. It is a wildly decentralized, highly adaptable system driven entirely by the heavy burden of personal accountability, a reliance on clear ethical blueprints, and the messy, friction-filled reality of local democratic governance.
And whether you, the listener, share these specific religious convictions or view them entirely from the outside, there is immense psychological, sociological, and organizational value in studying this model.
Absolutely.
It provides a real-world blueprint for how a community can sustain itself across centuries, not through coercion, not through top-down mandates, and not through the threat of state violence, but through purely voluntary conviction and the distributed, shared responsibility of its individual members. It proves that a system built entirely on individual integrity can, in fact, scale globally.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day.
Let's hear it.
In our modern, highly complex world, we constantly, almost reflexively rely on massive centralized institutions to solve our problems.
We really do.
We look to sprawling federal governments, we look to monopolistic tech corporations, and we look to highly centralized global financial systems.
Right.
We expect the top to fix the bottom.
Right.
But looking at the survival, the resilience, and the sheer dominance of this 400-year-old tradition, what can we learn from a model that insists true power and true integrity can only ever flow from the bottom up?
That's a great question.
Could the congregational autonomy model, this radical idea of localized responsibility, absolute voluntary commitment, and distributed authority, be the secret to building better, more resilient, and more ethical secular communities today?
It's a profound thought, especially when we consider how incredibly fragile, heavily centralized systems prove to be when their elite leadership inevitably fails. When a centralized system rots at the head, the whole body dies.
Right.
But when a decentralized system fails in one local node, the rest of the network survives and adapts.
Think back to that open source software rebellion in the dusty prisons of the 1600s. They proved that you do not need the king to own the operating system for the network to thrive. You just need individuals who are fiercely, relentlessly willing to maintain the code themselves.
Beautifully said.
Thank you so much for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive. We hope it sparked some profound aha moments for you and for the Kenny within. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep maintaining your own systems of integrity, and we'll see you next time.